There's an old maritime superstition that sailors whisper to one another over late-night drinks or during long hauls across quiet seas. They say the ocean never gives up her dead. The deep keeps them, holds them close, and sometimes sends them back. It was the summer of 1987 when I joined the crew of the Delila, a weathered fishing trawler that sailed out of Nova Scotia. She was a sturdy vessel, built for the rough waters of the North Atlantic, and her crew was a mix of old hands and greenhorns, like me. The pay was decent, and the captain, Jonas Harker, was known to be fair but no nonsense. We'd been at sea for about 2 weeks, filling the holds with cod and haddock, when we hit a patch of calm water just after sunset. The sky was a bruise of purple and red, and the sea was glass, smooth and eerie. I was on the deck, hauling in the last of the nets, when I saw something bobbing in the water off our starboard side. At first, I thought it was just a piece of debris, some old fishing gear or driftwood, but as it floated closer, I realized it was a body. "Man overboard," I shouted, my voice carrying over the silent waves. The crew scrambled, but when we pulled the body aboard, we were met with a grim sight. It was a sailor, judging by the tattered remains of his clothes, but he had clearly been dead for a while. His skin was bloated, his eyes sunken, and his limbs stiff. Yet there was something strange. His body hadn't been touched by the sea. No fish bites, no signs of decay. It was as if he had just been dropped into the water. Captain Harker stood over the corpse, his face grim. "Poor bastard," he muttered. "Toss him back. We can't keep him." That didn't sit right with me. Shouldn't we try to figure out where he came from? Maybe report it? But the captain shook his head. "Ain't nothing we can do for him now, and we don't want to bring the dead onto the boat. Bad luck." The crew, superstitious lot that they were, agreed. Reluctantly, I helped the others heave the body back overboard. We all watched as it drifted away, slowly disappearing into the twilight. That night, the wind picked up. It came out of nowhere, a sudden squall that sent us scrambling to secure the deck. The sea, which had been so calm just hours before, turned violent. Waves crashed over the bow, and the Delila rocked and groaned like an old woman struggling to stay upright. I was on watch when I heard the first voice. It was faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. A man calling out. I thought maybe it was one of the crew, but when I stepped out onto the deck, there was no one there, just the howling wind and the roar of the sea. But the voice came again, this time clearer. "Help me." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was coming from the water. I peered over the railing, straining to see through the darkness. And that's when I saw them. Dozens of them, bodies floating just beneath the surface, their pale faces staring up at me with dead, glassy eyes. Their mouths moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the storm. Their arms reached up, fingers grasping at the air as if they were trying to pull themselves onto the ship. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat, and ran to find the captain. I told him what I'd seen, but he dismissed it, saying it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes. But I wasn't the only one who had seen them. One by one, the other men came forward, pale and shaken, whispering about the voices, about the bodies in the water. That's when the Delila groaned, like something was pressing against her hull. The storm raged on, and the Delila fought to stay upright. Captain Harker barked orders, but I could see it in his eyes. He was afraid. The sea had turned against us, and it wasn't just the wind or the waves. It was something deeper, something ancient. We tried to keep to our duties, to focus on the ship and ignore the voices that called from the water. But the bodies, those ghostly figures just beneath the surface, were relentless. Every time I looked overboard, I saw more of them, pressing against the hull, their dead hands scraping at the sides, as if trying to claw their way up. And then, just before dawn, we heard the splash. One of the deckhands, Tommy, had gone overboard. No one had seen him fall, but we all heard it. The unmistakable sound of a body hitting the water. We rushed to the railing, but he was already gone, pulled beneath the waves. We searched for hours, but there was no sign of him. By the time the storm finally passed, we had lost 3 men. Tommy, plus 2 others who had simply vanished during the night. There was no explanation. No one had heard them fall, and the sea had swallowed them without a trace. We were left with a skeleton crew, exhausted and terrified. Captain Harker tried to keep us focused, insisting that we finish the haul and head back to port. But the whispers wouldn't stop. Help. Me. I couldn't sleep. None of us could. The sound of those voices rising and falling with the tide was impossible to escape. And the bodies, they were still there, drifting just beneath the water, waiting. Their faces pressed against the hull, their dead eyes following us wherever we went. On the final night before we reached port, I was on deck alone, staring out at the dark sea, when I saw something that chilled me to my core. A figure was standing on the water. At first, I thought it was one of the crew, but as it drew closer, I realized it wasn't a man at all. It was the first body, the one we had pulled aboard days ago, the one we had tossed back into the sea. But now, it was standing upright, walking across the surface of the water, its eyes locked on me. Behind it, more figures rose from the waves. Dozens of them. Hundreds. All the bodies we had seen over the past week, coming for us. I backed away, my heart racing, and shouted for the others. They came running, but when they saw what I had seen, their faces went pale with horror. Captain Harker grabbed me by the arm, dragging me below deck. "We've got to leave them behind," he said, his voice tight with fear. "They're not after the ship. They're after us." That night, we abandoned the Delila. We lowered the lifeboats and rowed for shore, leaving the ship to drift, her holds full of fish, her decks empty. As we rowed, I looked back one last time. The bodies were climbing onto the Delila now, swarming over her like ants, their dead hands reaching, their voices still calling. The sea never gives up her dead, and sometimes they come back to take the living. The lighthouse at Blackmoor Point had stood for over a century, its beams sweeping over the jagged rocks that lined the coast. For as long as anyone could remember, it had been manned by a single keeper, a recluse by the name of Thomas Blake. He was a man of few words, with a face weathered by the sea, and eyes that seemed to see beyond the horizon. The villagers whispered about him, but no one dared to ask too many questions. The lighthouse was his domain, and he guarded it like a fortress. I was young when I first met him. My father, a fisherman, used to take me out on his boat, and we'd pass by the lighthouse on our way back to shore. I'd see Blake standing on the rocks, staring out at the ocean like he was waiting for something, or someone. There was something unsettling about the way he stood, so still, as if the sea was speaking to him in a language only he could understand. Years later, after my father passed, I took up work as a deckhand on one of the local trawlers. It was a hard life, but the sea had always called to me. One night, we were caught in a storm. the kind that turns the sky black and churns the ocean into a raging beast. Our captain tried to steer us to safety, but the wind howled like a banshee, and the waves crashed over the deck, threatening to pull us under. That's when we saw the light from Blackmoor Point, cutting through the storm like a beacon of hope. We fought our way toward it, praying we could make it to the rocky cove before the ship was torn apart. As we neared the shore, I caught a glimpse of the lighthouse in the distance. The beam was steady, but there was something wrong, something I couldn't quite place. We anchored in the cove, battered but alive. The storm raged on through the night, and when dawn finally broke, I decided to hike up to the lighthouse to thank Blake for guiding us to safety. The climb was treacherous, with jagged rocks and steep cliffs, but I eventually reached the top. The lighthouse stood tall against the gray sky, its windows dark and silent. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time, but still nothing. A strange feeling crept over me, an unnatural stillness in the air, as if the wind itself had stopped to listen. I tried the door, and to my surprise, it creaked open. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of salt and oil. The place was dark, lit only by the dim light filtering in through the windows. I called out for Blake, but my voice seemed to die in the silence. There was no sign of him, no sign of anyone, in fact. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I climbed the spiral staircase to the top, hoping to find some explanation. But what I found was far worse. The lantern room was empty. No flame, no oil, nothing. The great lens, which should have been rotating, was frozen in place, covered in dust. My heart sank. There was no way that light had been shining during the storm. But then, how had we seen it? As I stood there, staring at the darkened lantern, I felt a cold draft sweep through the room, as if the air itself had turned to ice. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned to leave, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite process. That's when I saw the notebook. It was lying on a small table near the window, its pages yellowed and brittle. The name Thomas Blake was scrawled across the cover in faded ink. I opened it, my hands trembling slightly as I turned the pages. The entries were dated years ago, but the words felt fresh, alive with a madness I could feel creeping up the back of my neck. June 12th, 1912. The voices are louder tonight. I can hear them in the wind, in the waves. They're calling to me, calling me back to the sea. June 14th, 1912. The light. It won't go out. I've tried. God knows I've tried. But every night it shines again. Brighter. Stronger. The ships keep coming. They see the light, but they don't know. They don't understand. June 18th, 1912. I saw them today, walking on the shore. Their faces are gone. It's them. The ones I couldn't save. They want me to join them. The entries continued, each one more desperate than the last. Blake was losing his mind, or perhaps the sea had already claimed it. But what struck me most were the last few entries, written in a shaky hand, almost illegible. July 5th, 1912. The sea is coming for me. I hear it in the waves. I see them in the fog. The lost ones, the shipwrecks. They're coming home. July 7th, 1912. I can't fight it anymore. The light. It's theirs now. I see them, walking through the mist. I am one of them. The final entry was dated the night of the storm, just 2 days before. The ink was smudged, as if written in a hurry, or with a trembling hand. July 9th, 1912. They are here. The light is no longer mine. It belongs to them. I can hear them calling. The shipwrecks. I'm coming. I slammed the notebook shut, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands were cold, numb. Blake was gone. But the light, how had it guided us through the storm? I descended the stairs as fast as I could, my boots echoing in the silence of the tower. The wind had picked up outside, and as I stepped through the door, I saw it. The fog rolling in from the sea, thick and heavy, creeping up the cliffs like a living thing. And in the distance, barely visible through the mist, were figures. Dark, twisted shapes, moving along the shore. I ran down the path, slipping on the wet rocks as the fog closed in around me. The whispers began then, faint at first, but growing louder with every step. Voices carried on the wind, calling my name, pulling at me, begging me to return to the lighthouse. By the time I reached the cove, the fog had swallowed the land whole. The ship was waiting, anchored in the calm waters, but something was wrong. The crew was gone. I climbed aboard, searching every corner, but all I found were wet footprints leading to the edge of the deck, and nothing else. I looked back toward the lighthouse, its beam cutting through the fog once more. The light was shining, bright and steady, just as it had during the storm. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't Blake who was guiding us anymore. The shipwrecks had come home. The North Atlantic is a lonely place, especially when you're caught in the thick of the fog. The kind of fog that clings to your skin like cold breath, thick enough to hide anything just a few feet away. Captain Eamon McKenna had sailed these waters all his life, but nothing could prepare him for the final voyage of the Orpheus. We had set out from a small port in Ireland, a cargo ship bound for Newfoundland. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip. I'd done the route countless times, and I knew the waters well. The weather was rough, sure, but nothing we couldn't handle. Still, the first sign of trouble came the night before we lost contact. I remember it clearly. A thick fog rolled in out of nowhere, swallowing the horizon whole. It wasn't unusual to see fog at sea, but this wasn't like anything I'd experienced before. It moved too fast, like it had a life of its own. It wasn't the kind that came with a cold breeze. This one brought stillness, a dead calm that settled over the ocean like a heavy blanket. The crew grew restless. Whispers spread among the men, stories of phantom ships and ghostly figures that followed the fog. Old sailors' tales, I thought, the kind that get passed around over too much rum on cold nights. But as the hours dragged on, I started to feel it too, a presence, something lurking just beyond the reach of our floodlights. By the third day, the fog hadn't lifted. It hung over us, thick and impenetrable. The radio began to crackle with static, cutting in and out, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't reach anyone on shore. The compass started spinning wildly, and the GPS flickered in and out. We were drifting, blind and directionless, somewhere in the vast expanse of the Atlantic. It was around that time the first mate, Callahan, came to me with reports of strange behavior among the crew. At first, it was small things. Men talking to themselves, pacing the deck at night, staring out into the fog as if they could see something the rest of us couldn't. They were haunted, eyes glassy and distant. One of the deckhands swore he heard voices calling his name from the mist. He said it sounded like his mother, long dead, whispering to him from the depths. I dismissed it at first, blamed it on the stress of being trapped in this endless gray void. But when the men began to disappear, I couldn't ignore it any longer. It started with the night watchmen. Each one would go to their shift, and by morning, they were gone. No sign of a struggle, no trace of where they might have gone. Only their soaked boots left behind, still neatly placed by the railing. The rest of the crew grew paranoid, staying close to the center of the ship, never alone for long. But it didn't matter. Each night more of them vanished, as if the sea itself was swallowing them whole. That's when I turned to the ship's log, hoping it might give some insight, some way to make sense of what was happening. But the entries only grew more frantic, more cryptic as the days passed. "The fog is alive," one entry read. "It watches us, follows us. The sea is calling. I see them in the mist, faces. I know them, but they aren't human anymore." By the 7th day, I was the last one left, alone on the Orpheus, drifting through a ghostly sea, with nothing but the whispers for company. The fog had seeped into every corner of the ship, cold and damp, making it impossible to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel it creeping closer, pressing against my skin, wrapping around my throat. That's when I saw them. I was standing on the deck, staring out into the fog, feeling it pulse around the ship, like a living thing. My hands were trembling, but I couldn't look away. The whispers had grown louder, indistinct voices calling out from the mist, rising and falling with the ocean's breath. At first, I thought it was just the fog playing tricks on my mind, but then I saw them. Dark figures moving in the distance, shadows shifting just beyond the reach of the ship's lights. There were dozens of them, maybe more, gliding silently across the water, their shapes barely distinguishable from the mist itself. I felt a cold dread settle into my bones as they drew closer, their forms becoming clearer with each passing second. They looked like men, but their bodies were wrong, elongated, twisted in ways that defied nature. Their eyes glowed faintly in the fog, hollow and vacant, like the empty sockets of skulls. I tried to move, but my legs felt rooted to the deck, paralyzed with fear. One of them drifted closer, its face coming into view. It was Callahan, or what was left of him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth hung open as if frozen in a silent scream. His eyes, once full of life, were empty now, black pits that seemed to swallow the light around him. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the void, but eventually the figures began to fade, slipping back into the fog as if they had never been there. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the sweat running down my back despite the cold. I rushed back to the cabin, locking the doors behind me, but the whispers followed. They were inside the ship now, growing louder, more insistent. I knew then that there was no escape. The Orpheus was theirs. It always had been. I tried to send out one last message, something to warn others, but the radio only crackled with static. My hands shook as I wrote in the log, my final entry barely legible through the haze of fear. It's here. It's come for us. The last thing I remember is the fog creeping under the door, a thin tendril of mist winding its way toward me, and then darkness. When the Orpheus was found a week later, there was no sign of the crew. The ship was adrift, the decks soaked with seawater, and the cabins eerily untouched. The logbook was there, but the last few pages were missing, torn out. The sea keeps its secrets, they say. And somewhere out there, in the endless fog of the North Atlantic, the Orpheus and her crew are still drifting, lost to the world, waiting for the next ship to answer the call of the mist. And so, as the waves continue their relentless whispers, remember, there are things out there, just beneath the surface, that will never be found. Ships vanish, yes, but sometimes it's not the ocean that takes them. It's something older, something patient. The next time you're near the sea, listen closely. You might just hear a faint creaking or the soft sound of a distant bell. But don't look too long into the deep. It just might be looking back. Sleep well, if you can.